You keep calling yourself a Wypipologist.
Yes.
Which is very funny. Well, what does that mean? Like, is that real or is it a joke?
It's both. So,
Of course.
it is, like, I think people think it's funny, but it's based on my philosophy that you cannot understand what racism is and how it affects society by learning about black people. Like, we'll learn about black history and think we're learning about racism. Nah, you're not. You just learn about black people. You're learning about the people who racism affected. If you really want to learn about racism and white supremacy, you have to study white people.
Right.
Because black people didn't perpetuate it. We didn't create it. We didn't even participate in the creation of the idea of race.
Right.
So to understand that, you have to understand white people. You have to study white people.
The Touré show. Okay, though. The Touré show. Okay, though.
That might be the best question I've ever been asked.
You're a phenomenal person. I mean, you legendary.
I am a fan of you, my brother.
My man Michael Harriot is also at the Griot, as am I. He also has a new book out called Black AF History, which is an extraordinary telling of Black resistance and Black history and Black family throughout the early century that we were here. And he's got an amazing podcast called Draped to Maniacs. Michael is brilliant. I love talking to him. He's become a friend, and I love that. So let's get into it. It's Michael Harriot on Touré Show. I love Black AF History, the book. It's fantastic. I think one of the big takeaways is that Black resistance to oppression, to white supremacy, has been happening since day one, and it's been happening in myriad ways, right? And it's not just running away or Nat Turner killing people. It happens in day-to-day, small little ways that we don't memorialize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. I think one of the things that is to me is important to understand is like how we resist in a system that, well, if you get caught or if at the end you might end up dead. So, telling stories of not just like people grabbing machetes and chopping off white people's heads, but resisting and like slowing down work.
Yeah.
Complying. Running away. Like, we talk about the Underground Railroad, but we don't talk about the people who just ran away, who'd never heard of the Underground Railroad or didn't know where to go and just like existed in swamps and in the woods and whole communities. So I think all of those stories of resistance to everything. And the most interesting thing to me is when you think about those people, right, the most astonishing thing is when like somebody like Harriet Tubman, who would run away from the most brutal form of human subjugation ever seen on the planet, and say, I gotta go back though.
Oh my God.
Just think about that. Like
risking your life,
like
risking
how
your
many
freedom.
people, like Frederick Douglass, all those people who escaped and then went back and
I could
helped.
see going back for my family. Could I go back for others? I don't know, which is a testament to her power, her will, who she was, her character, that she went, right? Because she was going back for people she didn't.
Random people. That's correct. Like, it is, I don't even know if brave is the word for it.
Beyond brave.
Yeah. And to be like, oh, this is what I do now. And then to go back to South Carolina in the Civil War, the bloodiest war ever seen on the history of on the face of the earth, and just help them end slavery. It's to me, all those kinds of resistance are just interesting to me.
Forrest Joe is my favorite character in the book. Tell him about Forrest Joe.
Forrest Joe was a person who was enslaved and ran away from the Carroll Plantation in South Carolina and formed one of these maroon communities, a community that existed, had like built homes and had food stores And he was a menace, though. He would feed the people by raiding nearby plantations. He would free other enslaved people.
Kind of a Robin Hood.
Right. He was a Robin Hood. And the interesting thing about him is that the legend of Forrest Joe was kind of created by white people.
Yeah.
That like they couldn't kill him because he had melted down lead he stole and created a bulletproof vest.
He really created the first bulletproof vest.
Right. And they found it when they raided the Maroon Village. And he was known to wear it. But the white people said, well, he's impervious to bullets. They couldn't fathom that he had figured out how the quote was to create a vest through which no ball could well pass. But they created this mythology because, like, there's no way he's smarter than us. So he must be a witch who's impervious to bullets. His legs must be extra long, which is how he gets away all of the time because, like, there's no way he's more agile than us. So he had created a intelligence network on plantations where other enslaved people was like, hey, you don't want to go over there tonight because they're waiting for you. And and this happened, he was in the news, like the top headline from 1820 to 1823, like 3 years. They were crazy. He was running them crazy.
And he seemed like he could disappear.
Right. And then he went on to the governor of South Carolina's plantation in broad daylight. And just start busting caps. And it was like, we gotta do something. And then the thing that they had to do was to create what is essentially America's first municipally funded police force. Mm-hmm. So when we talk about this, we talk about this idea that slave catchers became police. Mm-hmm. We can trace the lineage to Forrest Joe. And the Pineville Police Association was created to chase down Forrest Joe.
You touch on something that I think about a lot. That when we talk about racism, a lot of the time white people feel like we are physically superior to them, that we are better athletes, better dancers, better in bed, more in tune with our bodies, all these sort of things. And we are intellectually lesser than them. That's what they think, right? And they think we are not as smart as them, right? And they feel like they know that, right? So between those two notions is sort of American racism.
Right. But that notion was kind of fueled out of necessity by the Catholic Church, right? You can't have a religion that talks about grace and, liberty and all of the things that we believe about
treating others the way you want to be treated.
So you have to justify it by saying, well, they aren't like us.
They're animals.
Right. And that is the justification they used for this nation-building project of human subjugation, race-based slavery. But what's interesting is a lot of what they did contradicts that ideology and that philosophy. They went specifically and found people who knew how to grow rice, right? Like they knew those engineers, they knew those agriculturalists and horticulturalists. When you think about blacksmithing, the American form of blacksmithing is an African art that they knew exactly where to go to get blacksmiths. Cowboys, right, was every climate that exists on the face of the earth also exists in Africa. So they went to get men and women who knew how to raise cattle and drive cattle in Africa, from the plains of Africa. And so all of these things, we always think of it as labor and never talk about the intellectual property that was extracted using violence or the threat of violence. And that's the thing, like we flatten out slavery into a white man standing there with a whip making you work, and not all of, like, there were no climates like the climate in South Carolina in Europe. So how could they even fathom building houses through which the air flowed and would cool them off.
The
'Cause
Africans told them that.
The African architects that told them that. There was no cotton in Europe. There was no rice in Europe. So
you're saying they are awash in examples of Black or African intelligence.
Right.
And yet denying the intelligence of Black and African people.
And not that they not just discovered this talent, right? They would go back to the places to get them. Oh, we need some rice growers. We're going to the place that eventually became known as the Rice Coast of Africa, or the Gold Coast, because the rice was the gold, right? It was America's first edible cash crop, right? And so it contradicts that notion of like that intellectual inferiority, because they knew what these Africans could do. I remember I was commissioned to write this piece on the plantation tourism in Charleston, and 40% of enslaved people came through Charleston. And a woman on the tour asked about, how they knew how to grow rice. And the tour guide said, well, they had been doing it in Africa for centuries. And then she asked, it was like right after what they called the 100-year flood, and it happened a few years ago in South Carolina. And they said, how did this 1,700-acre plantation survive? And she said, well, the levees and the dams that the Africans built 300 years ago still work. So whenever we know a storm is coming, we just flood the plantation. And then when it dissipates or when it passes, we unflood the plantation. They had built that to grow rice, but it still works 300 years ago. So these weren't like big, strong people. These were engineers and architects and people who knew how to do things, and they knew exactly where to go to get them.
You're touching on something, too, that I think about a lot. When you talk about cotton and we talk about enslaved individuals and the value that America was able to put on them in the slave trade. It is the slave trade that allows America to become a global economic power. That is what transforms us from a small new nation into a global economic power. And it is critical to talk about slavery as a crucial ladder for the entire American economy.
Right. So even though we talk about the free labor, because even today, the biggest business cost for any corporation is the labor cost. But we don't talk about the other things. Just by reducing human beings to chattel, that allowed a huge economy to build, right? So those first Americans before...
You're like, no, it was always South Carolina.
Yeah, man. One of my premises that I always say is that if there is a Black America, South Carolina is its capital. All Black people have roots in South Carolina. 90% of the slaves disembarked in South Carolina. One estimate is that, 40% of the enslaved people disembarked in South Carolina. One estimate is that 90% of enslaved people spent some time in South Carolina, whether it was a little bit of time or a lot of time. And so, when we talk about American history, we usually talk about Philadelphia, Boston, and the Northeast. And when we talk about, Black people, we talk about the South because that's where we were. But I think it was important to understand, if you're from Mississippi, then if you go a couple generations back, you're from South Carolina. First of all, because Mississippi and Alabama were part of the Carolina territories until it was split up. And the other thing is no slave ships dropped off in Mississippi, right? They were coming to South Carolina and then they were going to Mississippi and Alabama through there. So South Carolina to me, and then the other things is because South Carolina was majority Black, the brutality and the laws of slavery were South Carolina laws that other states copied. And that's important to understand, to how we even understand racism in America was created by the white people in South Carolina.
You're talking about the resistance that's happening all the time. We are under a different attack now, but it remains persistent and powerful and traumatizing in its own way. Are we resisting in the same way now?
I think we are. I think our forms of resistance come in so many forms, right? And I think that what we see now when we look at resistance is an effort to, one, to get white people to understand what white people have been doing, like to contextualize history. But our resistance, like the Black Lives Matter movement, is no different than the Civil Rights movement,
sure.
and which is no different than the anti-lynching movement, which is no different than the abolition movement, right? And these movements evolved with the times, right? Like we can't. I mean, there are no machetes to pick up right now. But when you look at what the Panthers did and what groups did in the 1800s and the 1500s, the forms of resistance were like all Black people have ever done is try to be free. And the quest to be free in this country is dependent on the times.
Mm-hmm.
It's dependent on the generations of Black people and what they experience and what they know and how they relate to the oppressors who restrict their freedom. And I think that today that freedom and that striving for freedom looks different because it's not necessarily slavery, it's not necessarily lynching, it's not necessarily desegregation or the ending Jim Crow. It is ending the stuff that is not on paper, right? Like there are no segregation laws, so we can't petition Congress for that. We have to petition the public. We have to petition the large majority of people instead of saying, hey, we want to change the Constitution, or we want to have a civil rights law, or we want to get our voting rights. It's a little bit different because white people and the oppression tactics have evolved too.
Yes.
Right? Like voter suppression now isn't a law that says, you have to be able to count these jelly beans in a jar.
Right.
Or you have to pay a poll tax. So as the oppressive tactics evolve, we had to evolve with it.
Yeah, it seems a lot harder to fight against mass incarceration and the vast economic difference between what Black families have and what the average white family has. And even just to get people to understand that this is true, right? Because people always go, well, there's Oprah and there's poor white people in Appalachia, so
yeah. And then the other thing it's hard to get people to understand is where that comes from. Like, because before emancipation, why weren't prisons majority Black? Why were prisons majority poor white people until the 1870s, right? When you talk about mass incarceration. When you talk about mass incarceration, why are these vagrancy, evolved from vagrancy laws? And why aren't the things that white people do as restrictive under the law as what Black people do, right? And so to even conceive and to remember where this comes from is a heavy lift in and of itself, right? Because sometimes, if white people knew about redlining and how it segregated their communities, right? They'll ask, why are Black communities more violent, and not wonder why there are Black communities. What is that? Why is there a Black neighborhood? That is something that white people created, right?
For sure.
Right? And they'll ask, well, why don't Black people, for instance, you've heard this, value education, but not wonder, hey, has there ever been a second in the history of America where Black people had access to equal education?
I think about that a lot, and how education is the only place where taxation is applied locally. As a New Yorker, I pay taxes to live in New York. Those taxes fund roads that I will never drive on, parks that I will never visit. But when it comes to education, I am funding the local school So if you live in a depressed community, the local school will be shitty.
Right.
And if you live on the Upper East Side, the local public school is going to be the shit.
Right. And the other thing about that is that the idea of how that funding comes, you say taxes, but it's mostly property taxes. That's based on real estate that they segregated.
Right.
Right? So if most of education funding comes from a system that is unlike every other system in America, every other taxation system in America. It's a system that property taxes only fund education and like some local municipal laws, like, how we restrict the business district versus the residential area. But they don't fix roads. They don't depend on anything. Nothing depends on them except the schools. And you have to wonder, why is that? Well, that is the legacy of segregation, because these local municipal boards were divided during the segregation era so people could have more control over their communities. But we don't ask those questions.
You keep calling yourself a Wypipologist.
Yes.
Which is very funny. Well, what does that mean? Like, is that real or is it a joke?
It's both. So,
Of course.
it is, like, I think people think it's funny, but it's based on my philosophy that you cannot understand what racism is and how it affects society by learning about black people. Like, we'll learn about black history and think we're learning about racism. Nah, you're not. You just learn about black people. You're learning about the people who racism affected. If you really want to learn about racism and white supremacy, you have to study white people.
Right.
Because black people didn't perpetuate it. We didn't create it. We didn't even participate in the creation of the idea of race.
Right.
So to understand that, you have to understand white people. You have to study white people. And being raised in a black community, and homeschooled, by the time I got to be around white people for extended periods of time, I realized, I'm going to have to be intentional about understanding these people who I really don't know anything about. And where I found out about it was two things. One, when I started going to school, right? So I was supposed to be in the 5th grade. And the first day of classes, and like for the first week of classes, they would have me, I wouldn't go out to recess. They would take me into a room and they'd make me do all these tests because they had no idea, like, where, I had never taken standardized tests before, so they didn't know what kind of classes so I didn't have a history in the education system. So on the last day of that first week of school, they brought me into the principal's office, and it's like a bunch of white people were in there. My mom was in there. And the assistant principal, who like lived down the street from me, and he was black, and he knew my family all my life. And they asked me, like, "How did you do it?" And I was like, "Well, do what?" It's like, "Did somebody give you the answers?" Or like they were kind of also like accusing him of giving me the answers to these standardized tests, but he didn't even know it when he was called into the meeting. So he starts laughing, and then my mom starts laughing, and then, like, they were like, "Oh, you don't know, like, who this guy's family is? Like, oh, you think he cheated when he just beat y'all tests?" And so they skipped me up a grade and put me in what they call, the gifted programs back then.
Because your family is very educated
Right.
and interested in education and reading, so they had already taught you a lot of things that are on the test.
Right, exactly. And so they put me in this all-white class in a grade ahead. And one day, a friend they put another girl in there who became one of my best friends. And it was time for social studies, and we sat beside each other, and I was like, "Oh yeah, it's time for the part of the class that black people didn't exist until like 1900s." And the teacher heard it because my friend was laughing and slapped me in front of the whole class.
The teacher, corporal punishment.
Just slapped me.
Just hit you
First,
in
she
the
told me to
face.
apologize. I said, "I don't understand what you want me to apologize for." Like, I could not conceive of what I was supposed to apologize for. And so I didn't apologize, and she slapped me in front of the whole class. But that wasn't what did it. Well, after school, my friend, she was telling me, my sisters and her brother and all the people who walked home with us about it. And when she got to the part of what I said, all of the people, all of our friends, like, gasped, like, I can't believe you said that. And my sisters and I was like, what do you mean? Like, I don't understand. And that's when I realized I had to understand white people. They understood white people, and we didn't. That's why I became a Wypipologist, because I knew I had to understand it. I mean, unless I want to get slapped every day.
But wait, what is it that what do you understand about white people? What is a big sort of takeaway that helps you put them in context?
Well, one of the things is that first, black people have a subconscious deference to whiteness. We kind of change the way we talk around them. We change the way we talk to them, right? Like, we don't talk to white people how we talk to each other. We take a little aggressiveness out of our voice, right? We joke a little bit less. And then the other thing is,
we talk about race less.
Yes.
Right? So when we're alone, we talk
Right.
about race all the time.
Right.
We don't put in their face.
and the other thing is, white people are very unaccustomed to being told they're wrong. You have to learn how to couch. Like, black people will say, you lying. Well, you don't know what the fuck you talking about, right? We say that all the time.
You so stupid.
Yeah. And that's, like, think about that, though. Like, white people are very unaccustomed to being told that they're wrong. And we defer to that. We figure out ways to either avoid telling them they're wrong or how to tell them they're wrong in a way that they can find palatable and acceptable. And I had to learn that intentionally instead of subconsciously, like everybody else already seemed to know. I had to be intentional about learning how to act around white people and how to understand how whiteness really affected my world. It could get you slapped in the middle of class. It could get you accused of cheating when you was just doing what they told you to do.
Right.
Right. So I had to understand white people, not me, not race, not the concept of inequality. White people is the root of all of that.
So what else do you understand about white people through your study?
I learned that they don't use washcloths.
What?
White people don't use washcloths. Which is always surprising, like, that they still have.
Why does that matter? Why does that matter?
It's just a cultural difference that is interesting to me. Like, don't you think it is interesting that, like, one of the only remnants of black privilege in the world is that every hotel still has washcloths and white people don't use washcloths. Think about that, though.
But there's no such thing as black privilege.
Yeah, there's no such thing as black privilege. But I guess it's
you could use it you're talking about using washcloth in the shower. You could use it in the sink and wipe your face with it, right? It's easier than using a towel.
Yeah, I guess so. I don't know.
Right, and then you're not using the washcloth the way that you were talking about in the shower, right?
Yeah, but I think it's amazing that washcloths are still in hotel rooms. And this is like a joke, but I actually researched this, that white people really don't season their food. But it's also true, right? Like, other cultures, like if you go to an Indian restaurant or a Caribbean restaurant, there are specific seasonings that those cultures use. Part of that is because our diet was so limited and restricted that we had to find a way to make this stuff that we were eating taste good.
But no, you say, if we think about Indian, we know how that's going to taste.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about black soul food, what would white food taste like? What does white food taste like?
Scones. What's up? What are some white porridge? I feel like white people.
But porridge is the whole dish, right?
Right.
Like, we could make porridge,
But we gonna put some flavor in it. Some
gravy, some
dream.
this and that, right?
Yeah.
The Indians would put curry in it. They'll make it their own. Okay, European American, Make it your own.
Right.
What are you going to do to the waffles or the porridge? Or how are you going to make it your own?
Nah, they're not, right? Like, even with rice, right? You think about rice, like there's that chapter that I talk about, like the different rice dishes and the war between Perlo and Bog. But those are things like we found a way to make rice flavorful.
Right.
That was the whole concept of Bogs and Perlo. Like, white people just be eating rice, bro. Like, they be... So when I was in college, I had a roommate, and I like went home with them for like a weekend, where they had rice with just butter on it. Like, what?
So wait, when we talk about this, we talk about this to mean we are innovative and creative. We are inherently flavorful. We know how to make a way out of no way because they got the bullshit parts of the pig and they knew how to flavor it up and like make it a hearty. Okay, what does the flavorlessness of white cooking say about them?
I don't know if it says anything. So what is the absence? Like, can you quantify the absence of something? Right? Like, for real. So think about this. Like, they create food. Everybody eats food out of necessity, right?
Sure.
And other cultures found ways to make it enjoyable and flavorful and art.
Yeah, absolutely.
And white people's like, nah, we just gonna eat some porridge. Like, we just gonna drink some ale. Right? I don't know what that means.
I mean, we are talking specifically about white Americans, right? Because like France and Italy in particular have an amazing food culture.
Yeah.
Right? And I mean, Germany has a food culture. We may not think of it as great food, but there is a food culture in Germany, right? But like you and I could have an amazing time eating our way through France and Italy.
Right. So one of the
things, maybe Spain.
Yeah. Well, the French food culture is pretty relatively new after colonization, right?
Okay.
Like, you got to think about this, right? Like, all of the... This is interesting to me because again, I'm interested in this. I've gone down these rabbit holes. Like, all of the French desserts things, like French are the kings of dessert.
Supposedly.
There wasn't no sugar until they came over here to America. to the Caribbean and then to America. The French superiority with desserts is because they owned Haiti and supplied the world with sugar. So even what we attribute kind of to the French. Think about this. It's going to blow your mind. You know, tomatoes don't grow natively in Italy.
Okay.
That was a result of colonization, and tomatoes came after that. So all of those Italian dishes and what we think of as Italian food...
That's new.
...are relatively new. It's not like old... Like, you know, what we eat... A lot of, like, the rice food, the rice dishes, the perlos, the Indian foods, those go back centuries. Right?
Yeah.
Like, you can't even trace the lineage of them.
Yeah.
Right? But a lot of what we think of as even the good white culture's food comes from colonization and them taking a little bit from over there and a little bit from over here.
Why do you think white people now feel a need to perpetuate white supremacy? I noticed when Trump was running the first time, you see a lot on CNN, they go interview Trump voters. And the Trump voters would say, without being prompted, this is our last chance. And some of them would further explain what that meant in that they all know that the end of white... The era when black and brown people outnumber white people in America and Asian people outnumber white people in America is coming within our lifetime.
Yeah.
Should be around 2040, somewhere around there.
Depending on what you're talking about, right? Because, you know, like the American school system is already majority non-white.
If you are under 12 or something like that, then it's more, right? So that generation is already there growing. So is it a fear of us? Is it I think Ta-Nehisi is the one who talks about whiteness is all that it means is dominance. That's the only thing that it connects to.
So it's a couple of things, right? One, it's what I call white culture.
Okay.
So, and I taught a class called Race as an Economic Construct. Well, I didn't use philosophy or history, right? I used economic terms, not money, but supply and demand. So what white culture is, first of all, whiteness created, white people or Europeans created this pan-European ethic that became whiteness, right? Like they tie the French and the Greeks in the 1700s. They tied themselves to each other because, the English were kind of despised and the Greeks were different than the Italians, but they managed to tie all of that to this pan-European ethic. And a lot of that was a culture of scarcity.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, if you were a Germanic tribe, where we got the word barbarism or barbarians from, right? They conquered out of necessity. It was warlike out of necessity. If, the ground was made of rocks, they couldn't grow stuff. So the way that they fed their people and the tribes and themselves was to expand their territory. It was, warlike. And so the focus in technology was evolving warfare and methods of warfare. So when they met the Asians, they took fireworks and said, "Oh, we can use this to make guns." And when they make so that culture of scarcity necessitated the idea that we have to dominate and control and conquer. Right now,
This is what they're talking about in Exterminate All the Brutes.
Right.
Amazing documentary on HBO.
Exactly. It's based on that It's based on that idea. I think it is an economic principle, and so what that ideology creates is if you have a culture of dominance and conquering, you believe that your ability to conquer other people, other cultures who weren't concerned with dominance, right? Like if you come to Africa, like when the white people showed up to Africa, they didn't kill them because it was like, wait, there's some more people, right? When they came to America, the Native Americans, the indigenous people fed them because they weren't like, what's this dominant stuff? Like it's just more people, different kinds of people. We'll welcome them in, we'll feed them, we'll teach them how to grow some stuff. We'll teach them, hey, don't drink that water that you pooped in. Because but what their culture told them was that our ability to conquer and dominate these people reflects our superiority.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So part of it is that culture of dominance that evolved from that culture.
That remains in the sort of DNA or lizard brain of whiteness, that dominance.
No, well,
is
I don't even know if it results. It survived in the lizard brain. It's what they built into this society, right?
White dominance.
White dominance, right? Like manifest destiny. God wants you to own all the land. Is that same culture of dominance, right? Gentrification is just micro-manifest destiny. Is micro-colonialism is what gentrification is. A culture of dominance. If I move here, I get to change the stuff. I can tell the people above me, turn the music down.
This is part of what you're, like, Karening is asserting dominance.
Right.
And there isn't a parallel culture of black Karening because that's not how we move in spaces. But there's there's constantly white Karens.
Right. And then the other aspect of that is the idea that a lot of white people don't know. And that's the point of this book,
Don't know.
History, don't know about other cultures, about that there were cultures that didn't need to be, warrior-like, didn't need to conquer, right? And so they think that their ability to just take this land and to take Africans and to take the whole Caribbean is because of their superiority instead of, like nobody else wanted to be at war for the rest of history like that. And when you think about that, the idea of Black history in American schools is relatively new. That's what a lot of people don't understand.
Well, it goes back to like the 70s when we
the late
started
60s.
talking about African-American, Afro-American teaching.
Black studies.
Black studies, yeah.
Yeah, that Black studies movement is, late 60s, really late 60s, 68, 69.
Yes.
But really the 70s,
yes.
right? So the teachers who taught us in schools,
Yes.
they never sat in a classroom, one that taught them about Black people, and many of them never sat in a classroom with Black people. So a lot of what we hear about wokeness, about CRT, is because they don't know things. They don't know what Black people did. They don't know what white people did to Black people. And they don't know the history of this country except the mythology that they've been told. So when they see this world getting fair, when they see this world getting equitable, they think we're trying to take the things that they have dominated and conquered and redistribute them to the world instead of everybody doesn't have that culture of dominance like white people do.
There's an maybe 15 years old Harvard study. White people see race as a zero-sum game that they are losing.
Yeah.
It's a scarcity mentality.
Yeah.
That if we give jobs, leadership, whatever, money to them, that's being taken away from us.
There's like a University of Pittsburgh study where they got like third graders and they got them into a room and they said, hey, if you were living in, one of the questions was, if you're living in a community and outsiders come and you don't have enough food, what do you do? And it's like 80% of the white children said, you just can't let them into the community. And the rest of the people said, oh, well, then we got to grow more food or we got to eat less food, right? And that's like, everybody knows that we won't be hungry if we eat a little bit less and then everybody can flourish. But there is a weirdness to the idea of, hey, we got to just let them starve because I don't want a little bit less.
Ask everybody who comes on the show, what does being Black mean to you? So, to you.
I think being Black, and when I say Black, I mean, the culture and the history of Black Americans.
Yeah.
I think it means being tied to the art, the culture, and the story of America that was created out of nothing. When I think about being Black, to me, the essence of being Black is I am part of a people who came here with nothing, not a language to speak, no possessions, not even a family, and built all of the music, the culture, the art, the history, the economy of what became the biggest superpower in the world. We did that. We built these communities, we built institutions, and if you look at Black people where they are now, knowing in a very short period of history where we came from, nothing, absolutely zero. It is the greatest story in the history of the planet. There is nothing that has ever been done to a people that hadn't been done to Black people en masse. And to look at where we are, not just survive, but to look at what we built, what we did, that to me is being Black, and that is the greatest story that's ever been told. And if you ever told it, it almost sounds like fiction.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like Forrest Joe.
Yeah.
Right? Because you cannot believe what Black people did. It is impossible to believe what we did in reality from where we started from. And to me, that's what being black is. Like being a hero so unbelievable that they gotta find a way to not tell that story.
Yeah. Hell yeah. Hell yeah. Got an amazing podcast.
Yeah.
Draped to Maniacs. I love that. It's just a really alive, dynamic, living vision of history and telling these stories, and should be part of curriculums.
Yeah, when I started creating it, I wanted it to be different than anything like people who listen to podcasts have ever heard. I think we achieved that, and it's like I would like to take credit for it, but it ain't me. Like I am a small part of the genius that it is. Like we have sound people who spend time like dreaming up ways to tell the story, and voice actors. And
it's very alive in that way. Lots of different voices, lots of different ways of doing it, right? A lot of podcasting, it's sort of a flat sonic experience, and this is a very dynamic sonic experience.
Right. And one of the things that I'm proudest of, first of all, is that it is created and like no hands touch it except black people. Nice. But the other thing that I love is that I really can't describe it because it is not, there are no comparables, right? Like I always say, like, imagine if the Chappelle Show met the 1619 Project.
That's about right.
Yeah,
for sure.
And the thing that I love about it is, like, I am a fan of it because if I even, like, I'll see the script and I'll write the script and I'm still excited to hear it it's crazy what the rest of the people do to it to make it alive. Like I like that expression that you use, that is very alive, because I never thought about it, but it really is. Like it starts with an idea, and it's really alive. The idea of hearing Ida B. Wells as a battle rapper, or like ideas like that. Like it is very interesting to me.
And in the show and in the book, you have a really interesting way of mixing your sense of humor in with the story. And, Black history is not PG. It's not even rated R. It's quite often rated X. It's traumatizing. I remember the first time I took my kids through the Black Smithsonian in D.C., National Museum of African American History and Culture. And, my daughter's crying, learning about some of the stuff that happened. My son wants to see the lynching picture, but he doesn't. So I covered his eyes, and then I let him see it for 2 seconds, and then covered his eyes again, which is what he wanted. But it was like, wow, that was a lot.
Yeah.
And just going through that whole thing, it's a lot. And so you injecting humor, it leavens it. I'm also like, do I want it to be leavened? I mean, as a creator, I do, but then as a, when we talk about the history, I'm like, it should be hard, because that shit was very difficult to live through.
Yeah, but the idea that serious things can't be funny, I would argue, is also based on a white construct. Have you ever been around black people and not laughed?
Right.
At a funeral?
Right.
At horror things?
Right.
All of that. The American form of comedy came from black people, came from slavery, came from our ability to laugh through pain. And so I don't even think I inject humor. I just don't leave it out. I do it like black people do things. And there's no need to be serious about this serious issue if I'm going to do it like how black people do it. Like, you've been at a funeral and somebody walked in wearing a crazy hat or a old suit or what they had on at the club last night. We're going to say it. And I think that's what the podcast does.
What is the key to being great at Spades?
The ability, first one, experience. The ability to count, in 13s. Because the multiplication of spades is 13s and 4s. And to have a partner that you can communicate with telekinetically.
See, that is a big thing. How much you can communicate with your partner. You're not really supposed to.
Yeah, but see, that's the problem.
You said
like
telekinetic, but we know, right? You mean I can say a little thing or I can give a little wink and they kind of know.
If you've played spades enough with your partner, you can tell they are saying things to you
with the cards.
That's
totally legal.
Right.
And that's the higher level that you should be able to. But some people be kind of like, yeah, wow, was really cold 2 days ago. Like,
you
can't do that.
That's cheating. But the people who need to do that don't know what they're doing. Like, I don't even worry about those people because you don't need to talk across the board, especially if you have a partner where you used to. Like, if my partner plays 4 of spades on the second book of the hand, I know what he's trying to tell me. He doesn't have to say anything.
What is he trying to tell you?
He's trying to tell me that he either has the king, he has the next club, or that he has very few clubs and he's going to be cutting them, so he's getting rid of them. He doesn't have to talk to me as like, I am almost headed to the club, or I ain't going to the club tonight, right? He don't have to do that, right? Because I know what he's saying when he plays that. And it's not just like playing with them a long time. If you play with somebody who knows how to play spades, you know what they're saying when they do certain things, right? And so that is the key, like to counting and experience. Because if you get good, then you know when you're playing with somebody else who's good, you know what they're doing. You don't have to cheat. And also talking junk. But you got to talk junk, right?
But you got to talk junk. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thanks so much to Michael for a great interview, and thanks to you for listening. Touré Show gives you fuel to power your dreams because you can use your dreams like a rocket ship to blast you into a life you never imagined. You can make your dreams a reality. Maybe this show can help. You can find me on Instagram at Touré Show. Touré Show is written by me, Touré, and produced by Jennifer Brown. Our editor is Ryan Woodhall. Our booker is Claudia Jean, and we're distributed by DCP Entertainment. And we will be back next week with more amazing guests because the man can't shut us down.